proxies. You already heard a brief introduction from them. In just a moment, we'll have a chance to hear a little bit longer introduction from each of the candidates. They'll have a 90-second introduction. After that, we'll move into, there were 3 questions that were provided to them ahead of time, 2 just general education and 1 specifically around special ed. And so they'll have 2 minutes each to answer those questions. And at that point, we'll go to the audience questions. As I said, if you have one that you've completed, if you just hold it up, we'll be circulating around the room and gathering those, and then presenting those. And for those questions, they also will have 2 minutes to answer each of those questions as well. Sorry, I've been running around. I don't remember if I said, my name is David Schmidt. I'm in District 48. So, after a while, it's like, all the details. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? For our introductions, we'll start it at the far end there with David Hann's proxy.
Sure. So my name is Samantha Fletcher, and I'm representing Senator Hann, who had a previous commitment and sends his regrets, but says he'd like to extend his thanks to Catherine Callahan and Hopkins LAC for hosting this event, and apologies for being unable to attend. Education is the most important thing we do, and it was the desire to see every student in our state have the same educational opportunities as his children that led him to run for political office. He has had the honor of serving on the Eden Prairie School Board and the State Senate, where he has been a member of both the Senate Education Finance and Education Policy Committees. This experience has led him to believe that strengthening local school boards is key to improving our E-12 system. We face many challenges in assuring that all of our students get the education they need. He is committed to continuing to work with the LAC and the Senate in achieving this goal. Thank you.
For those of you that don't know me, I came from Superior, Wisconsin as a high school graduate in the mid-70s. Times were tough, so I hitchhiked down to Minneapolis looking for opportunity. I worked my way through college at the University of Minnesota. I fell in love with a beautiful girl and we got married. We had a couple of great kids, and I got a job teaching American government at Eden Prairie High School. I did not know it then, but what I was looking for was a Minnesota miracle, and I found it here. For over 30 years, I've taught my students the importance of political efficacy, civic virtue, and the common good. As I reflect on those times when I first came down here, I started thinking about the idea that miracles don't happen in a vacuum. They happen when people get together, put partisan politics aside, and work towards a shared vision. I'm running for Minnesota Senate because I want to be part of the next Minnesota miracle. Health, economy, education, and transportation are all interconnected, and our policies should be as well. As a husband and a parent and a teacher, I know how important it is to honor our commitments to get the job done. I will bring that same work ethic I brought into the classroom and that standard of excellence to the Capitol. If we put partisan politics aside, we can meet the challenges of the 21st century and build a brighter future for our students and ourselves.
All right. Well, my name is Lori Pryor, and I'm running for House District 48A. What I want to start out by saying is this is my home. This is where our 3 kids graduated from high school. Sam's here tonight. He graduated in 2004, right? Right. So thank you for having us, and also thank you for hosting this discussion. I mean, I think this is a great way to really start the meat of the campaign season, is to talk about the issue of education. And when you go to door, that's really the first thing that comes up, that and gridlock. But education, education is something that we're all here to support, and it's this discussion tonight that I think is really going to move us forward and to keep, that's an exchange of ideas, your questions, our answers, what we're thinking, and it's part of the civic engagement that we need. I'm running because of my 4 grandkids, so I am thinking about the future. I am thinking about how great things were for my kids when they went to Hopkins High School, when they graduated, when they started in their careers. And I want to make sure we have those opportunities going forward. So that's why I'm running. What do I bring to it? I bring to it, some of it is my volunteer experience. I spent 19 years volunteering as a coach and as a mentor in the Odyssey of the Mind Destination Imagination programs. Creative problem solving. Thank you, Barb, for getting me started in that.
It was fun.
Also, I worked as a professional consultant. I did communication consulting. I did team-based problem solving. And what we did in team-based problem solving is we worked for consensus, and we worked for the better solutions to answers. So with this background, as a mom, as a grandmother, as a problem solver, I think I have something to offer the legislature, and I hope that tonight I earn your vote.
Great, next we'll go to the first of the two questions that were sent out. I'll go ahead and read the question, and unless I need to restate it later, I'll just read it the once, and then we'll listen to all three of the responses. So the first question is, adequately funding education is a concept virtually every candidate supports. In an era of underfunded mandates such as world's best workforce, special education service requirements, digital literacy directives, funding has not even kept up with inflation, let alone funded the expanded requirements. What would you do differently to fully fund public education requirements in Minnesota? So we start with a different one. We'll start in the middle this time.
First of all, let me start by saying that public education is one of the most important resources that makes our state special. Education is one of only two duties of the state legislature under the Minnesota Constitution. Article 8, Section 1 of the Minnesota Constitution reads, "The stability of a Republican form of government, depending upon the intelligence of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools." I promise you right now that I will never, ever borrow money from our schools to make it look like the state budget's balanced. One of the first things the legislature could do would be to provide the increase in special education funding to help close the cross-subsidies gap. Special education services are mandated by the federal government, and they have failed to live up to their promise to fund 40%. In fact, they've never even lived up to 20%, usually hovers around 17 to 18%. The result is that Minnesota schools must fund the remainder of special education programming out of the general fund. So I would start by leaning on our partnerships with our federal officials, making sure that our lines of communication are open and putting pressure on them to fully fund their commitments to Minnesota. And at the state level, we must provide more adequate funding through our basic funding formula. But our approach to budgeting in Minnesota needs to change. For 33 years, my students depended on me to show up, do my job, and complete the lesson plan by the time the bell rang and the course ended. As elected officials and candidates, I think that our students are still depending on us to be prepared, plan ahead, and meet our commitments. Education funding should not be a political football that is up for grabs every 2 years, and it should not be dependent upon geography and local referendums. Every student in Minnesota deserves a high-quality, affordable education, starting in early childhood, through K-12, and through post-secondary.
Okay? All right, so the question, we're talking about the unfunded mandates and what our approach would be and how that would be different. So I want to start by saying, just as I mentioned before, we're from the Hopkins School District. This is a familiar building. This is where we did Destination Imagination and Odyssey of the Mind. But this is also a familiar problem. When my kids were in junior high school, I met with the parent groups. And you know what they talked about? They talked about the unfunded mandates. And they particularly talked about special education as an unfunded mandate from the federal government. So this problem has been going on for a long time, and from what I'm hearing right now, it's only gotten worse. And so I understand this is a critical issue for our school districts across the state. So I think what we need to do is we need a few things. One is the state needs to be consistent. I mean, right now we might be talking about tomorrow's workforce, or the bill, that's workforce bill. All right, we need to stick with that, not just, okay, 2 years from now we're gonna do something else. So you still have that old one, and now we're moving on to something else at the same time. So what we're talking about is consistency from the state, and so that's one approach that I would look at. Something else that I'd wanna look at is the idea of being a problem solver. I mean, we bring together the stakeholders, we bring in LAC, we bring in the people that know most about the situation of the unfunded mandates. We say, well, what can we do to reduce maybe the number of them? Because we can find that, the 20-80 rule, that maybe 20% of them really are a burden. And of those, there's another 20% that really aren't fulfilling its mission. So they're burdensome and they're not doing any good. Let's identify those. let's reduce, let's figure out how to pull that together. Let's write legislation that gets rid of unfunded mandates that we don't need and aren't serving the purpose. And then also, so being that problem solver approach, coming up with the legislation to reduce the amount of unfunded mandates, let's go on to, and let's go back to what Steve just brought up. Let's talk about the federal government and their unfunded mandate in special education. That has never, as my understanding, it's never fully been funded. So if somebody has other information, they can bring it forward and I'd love to hear it. But let's get together, let's advocate at the national level. Senator Franken is on the education committee. We can be advocates together. And as a state representative, I'm elected, I will be that voice to the federal government too, to get these mandates funded.
I'm going to fully assume my proxy role and share my comments in the first person. As a former school board member, I know how difficult it is for school districts to deal with the continued growth of state mandates on local schools. The state legislature is good at requiring local school districts to implement new reporting regimens or adding specific curriculum elements into already overcrowded days. In many cases, these new requirements have additional costs that local districts are expected to absorb. And this practice by the legislature has gotten worse over time and needs to stop. School districts are governed by locally elected school boards. They need to be empowered and trusted to make the decisions that best fit the conditions of their districts and meet the expectations of local parents. The state legislature needs to show some restraint. We are not super school boards for the entire state. Instead of increasing mandates, the state should be strengthening the power of local boards to make decisions about curriculum, as well as raise and spend funds as they see fit. Instead of measuring how well school districts follow state mandates, we should focus on measuring results and give local schools the freedom to determine how best to achieve those results.
The second question, which we'll start with candidate Pryor. In the last decade, our general education per pupil increases have lagged inflation according to CPI. This lag has created a difference of approximately $350 or a 6% gap. How would you ensure that the legislature would correct this gap for schools to sustain their programs?
Okay. All right, so in talking with school board members, past and present, and with people from the LAC, members of the LAC, what they're talking about is, the perception is, and the reality is when you're not keeping up with inflation, if funding is flat, then really the effect of it is like being a budget cut. And that's, what the LAC member had talked to me, and they said, so in that sense, flat funding is like giving a cut. And so this is what we're trying to adjust. And when looking at the chart, since my youngest graduated, because funding has not been keeping up with inflation, it looks like we were cutting funding to schools. And this is an important issue, and I realize it's an issue that's been around for a long time also. So what can we do about this? There's a couple things that we can talk about. One is, we're in a time of surplus. So this is not a time to be talking about cuts to schools. So I think that we can begin with that and talk about having adequate funding to schools. We can also talk about the fact that we've kind of been it's been a yo-yo for school funding, where there's a surplus, it seems like, yep, the money's coming in, we're getting adequate funding, and then the state goes into a deficit again. And in 2010, there was the deficit to the schools, or the deficit to the state budget, and it was balanced by borrowing money from the schools, the popular understanding of it. It was a gimmick, it was an accounting shift, to take money from the schools and have them pay, they pay the loans to balance the budgets, the state's budget. So I think the first thing that the state can do is that we need to make sure there's reliable funding. So we talk about adequate funding, and we also need to talk about reliable funding. So the state needs to be fiscally responsible in balancing its budget. When we have a surplus, we fill the rainy day fund. So if the state heads into recession again, instead of having to take money from the local schools to balance the budget, during a recession, we go to the rainy day fund, and instead of making cuts to the schools. So really, the funding to schools, both adequate and reliable funding.
While the recent per pupil increases to the general education formula have lagged behind the rest of inflation, this represents only a portion of total education funding. When all elements of E-12 education are combined, the total has exceeded the rate of inflation over the last 2 decades. Funding for E-12 education is the top priority in the state budget and has been for decades the single largest state expense, consistently measuring about 42% of the state general fund. So, while the state general fund budget over the past decade has increased by 45%, E-12 funding has also grown at the same pace. The amount of money we spend on education is not an indicator of our success in educating our students. Despite the increases in spending, the achievement gap in Minnesota has remained the worst in the country. It is this gap, not a spending gap, that we should be focused on. Minnesota has always made education funding a priority, and it always will. Making sure all of our students are getting at least a strong foundation of basic skills and graduating from high school should be a higher priority.
In the last few years, the basic funding formula has seen increases, and Governor Dayton and the DFL leadership have fought to keep up with inflation. But even before that, we were falling behind in our pupil funding. Our per pupil funding formula has not kept up with inflation, as we've already heard. Right now, we are approximately $350 short per pupil. As an educator, I know firsthand what the effects are of insufficient funding. And I can tell you from experience that class size matters. It's time for a new approach. Instead of comparing our basic funding and per pupil funding to last year's amounts and making adjustments, we should shift our focus to the students of today and the needs of the future. This should include fully funding the arts, music, physical education programs that have been slashed in the last few years. We should shift our focus to the students of today and the needs of the future. This should include, right now, we are 46th in the nation, and I know we can do better in student-to-counselor relationships. I think it's time for another Minnesota miracle. Our incredible education system is one of the things that makes Minnesota stand apart, attracting world-class employers and developing world-class employees. With a growing diversity of students and dramatically changing needs, we need to be focused on the future, put everything on the table, and make a plan to fully fund the best education systems and one of the best educational systems in the world. We need to base our funding on the educational outcomes we are working for. We need to reevaluate what's gone wrong and how to best correct it. And we need to have equitable funding system for our schools that benefits every student in Minnesota, regardless of geography or family background.
Thank you. Before we go to the special education question, if you have questions that you've prepared, if you could hold those up, because I'd like to start looking at those as we listen to these next ones. My question gatherer is not here, so. Another second. The question, I had a question, do questions need to be about education? And yes, that is the focus of tonight's forum, so we do try to stay on the education topic. So.
Mr. Schmidt,
Yes.
that is the extent of my preparation for the
Okay.
questions. Is there anything else that you need?
No, the special education question did come much later, so that's probably why they didn't have time to get it to you. Thank you. But for our remaining two, our final prepared question. From your experience, what do students receiving special education services add to our community, and what have you done to advocate for them up to this point? And we'll go back to, I'm sorry, I will murder your names, candidate Steve.
It's been murdered before.
I know, I'm just gonna take the safe road.
The opportunity gap in Minnesota that exists is, as Senator Hann's proxy alluded to, is maybe even a larger problem than a funding gap. We have a large population, 15% of our students have cognitive or physical disabilities. Every parent and every child in this state wants to be heard. They want their voices to be heard. And over the years, when some of us were in school, the special ed students were put into a room in another building. And today, they're in our building. And it's where they need to be so that they can see and that we can see the benefits of this symbiotic relationship. And I'm so proud as an educator to know that that's how forward thinking we've become as a state. And Public Law 94-142, whatever, something like that, in 1975 said students need to be in the least restrictive learning environment. And that was all done by legislators at the federal and state level that knew we could do a better job. And the two things I would do as a legislator, we need to increase funding for pre-K so that students with cognitive and physical disabilities start school as much as on equal footing as every child in that kindergarten class. And we need to fund better. Right now, as I alluded to in my opening statement, we are 46th in the nation in counselor to student ratios. And when I found that out campaigning this year, I was just astounded because I thought we were the best at everything in Minnesota, and to find out we were 46th in that. And when a student with special needs needs to see their counselor for whatever reason, and the counseling department says we're full for today, you can come back tomorrow, that shouldn't be something that we should hold our heads up high on in Minnesota. So those would be the two things I would work on as a legislator.
Well, as I mentioned before, even back in 2000, well, in the 90s, when the law was first came down from the federal government, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. When it came down, it was not fully funded. And even back then, we were starting to advocate and be advocates for fully funding from the federal government. And so that is something that I will continue to do, is the funding for it. Because we know that this is, right now, it's, on the one hand, this is the essence of public education, which means it is available to all. And our school district's mission here, as it is in Eden Prairie and in Minnetonka, is to educate all the children. And so that's what we will continue to strive for. And so the special education is part of that, and it's the unique part of a public school. And when we talk about, you know, what's the difference between a charter school and what's the difference with a private school, and what do you see in a public school? A public school is for everyone, and that's kind of our American way to do that, is to have public education. But funding, it comes down to funding, and so I will continue to be that advocate for full funding for special education.
Thank you. So now we'll move to the questions that have been submitted, and again, as you complete a question, if you want to just hold your hand up or make its way here, it's even better.
Apologies.
No problem, thank you. We'll work our way through those. Since we're down to two now, we'll just alternate with who starts. So we'll start on this side with this one. In our increasingly globalized world, learning a world language is a key experience skill that our students must have. How will you support world language and immersion programs at the K-12 and post-secondary levels?
Well, I guess I will start by saying yes. I believe knowing another language and knowing a world language is an important part of education. So I can give personal experience. We did our best for teaching, for making sure our children were acquiring another world language, and we were particularly successful with our two oldest. And all your parents can say is that, and my husband now is here too, is that you were much better at world languages than either of us are. So, and I think that's because of the Hopkins Public Schools. So yes, I through our personal experience, I do believe that world language, knowing a second world language is important. And you know, it's what we can do is we keep watching to make sure that there is reliable and adequate funding in the budget to make these kinds of programs possible.
My two biggest regrets in my life is I don't know how to speak a foreign language, un poquito español, and I don't know how to play a musical instrument, much to my mother's chagrin over the years and all the attempts she made. I was talking to some people today about at Eden Prairie High School we don't offer Arabic, and it just seems like I'm astounded by that. And we offer the traditional classes, French, we offer French, Chinese, and sign language, which is pretty cool, but French, German, and Spanish, which is what most schools offer. We could do better than that. When we have foreign exchange students, and they're like, I speak 5 languages. And our kids are like, wow, I speak English kind of okay, and I'm in my 2nd year of Spanish. And I think it just sends this message to our own children that we're just dropping the ball in this global economy that David referred to, and we could do a lot better job at educating our students. And I think the Spanish immersion program in Eden Prairie does a great job. Hawkins has Mandarin Chinese immersion. Those are all great programs that we could do a better job at funding and making sure kids can compete.
Okay, thank you. This next question. There's a lot of research out there that suggests a good preschool education is important to the state's economic strength as well as early brain development. Yet Minnesota has fallen behind states like Georgia and Oklahoma in supporting early childhood programs and in paying preschool teachers equitably. Are you in favor of Minnesota making a major investment in preschool programming and in equalizing preschool teacher salaries? And if so, how would you do that?
Yes. Governor Dayton's done a great job at moving us forward in that capacity, but it's not fully funded. And so we can do a much better job at funding education. And one of the things we could do is to try to get that money that the federal government owes us. And let's just work at that. And as Lori said, Senator Franken is our friend. And if we could get that 20% that's been unfunded over the years, that's priceless money that has been promised to us. So let's get that money and let's start funding pre-K education so every one of those kids starts kindergarten on equal footing, ready to learn.
Right, so this is where the grandmother steps in. Yes. I'm looking at these toddlers, and I'm looking at our 5-year-old that just started kindergarten this year. And her parents were in a position where they could afford a really high quality preschool experience. And she's starting kindergarten in Minneapolis public school right now, but she's ready to learn. She's ready to learn, and it's based on, she has good parenting, she has nice grandparents, but she did have a good preschool, and she learned a lot in the preschool, and so she goes into that classroom ready to learn. And that's good, because there possibly are other children in that Minneapolis public school kindergarten that are not ready to learn right now. And they would have benefited from the same kind of programs that our granddaughter and our future and our other grandchildren will have before they get to that point, because they're all going to be enrolled in good preschool programs. And it's not because they don't have somebody that could take care of them; they do. But it's because preschool is more than just good care. There's a lot of education that goes on. So I do support the direction that we're going of getting more kids into high quality preschool program, especially those kids that are at risk, that don't have parents that are doing okay and can afford these programs. And when I'm out door knocking, I'm looking at these young families with these young children. And one of the things that they've told me is, you know what? Preschool, good preschool costs the same as a college education at a public school. So you're asking me to be sending my kids to preschool and paying for the preschool and saving for their college education at the same time? And I just started out on my career and I'm supposed to be saving for retirement too? How am I going to afford all this? So yes, I think that we are heading in the right direction. We started small with a pilot program, and we're going to see where it's most effective and how to best apply it. But we need to keep looking in this direction so that we bring every child